Soon after my sister was diagnosed with leukemia, her doctors told her her only chance for survival would be with a bone marrow transplant. Our older sister, Caroline, and I went to be tested, hoping we could become donors. We waited weeks for answers, only to find out that we matched each other, but neither of us could help Victoria. That long wait for answers was agonizing. I thought I understood what patients and their families go through and how to balance between caring and self-preservation as a neurosurgeon. I cared, but within limits, striving to maintain objectivity and detachment. I knew compassion was important, but this only went so far. Over years of training and practice, I had developed emotional armor to protect myself from grief and from sadness. I was afraid of making mistakes, of being wrong, of being overwhelmed by powerful emotions I didn't think I could handle. I didn't even know I'd developed this self-protective shell until I found myself on the receiving end of medical care instead of the provider's end where I normally live. And I saw all too clearly what it's like to be a patient and how inadequate was my prior stance, both for myself and for my patients. I'd like to take you on my journey of transformation, but first, I need to introduce you to my younger sister, Victoria. Victoria was 18 months younger than me. She was always in my life. She was fearless and would never back down, but was also incredibly loyal and kind. She was extroverted and brave. An actress, she was at home in front of a crowd. Nothing would have made her happier than to have stood in front of this audience. I, on the other hand, am far more introverted and am much more comfortable one-on-one with a patient in an exam room. 4 years ago, Victoria developed an aggressive form of leukemia. She wrote about it in her journal. She was hospitalized for nearly 8 months, continually, much of that time sealed in a room from the outside world. She couldn't even open a window to get a breath of fresh air. She had her bone marrow transplant, and ultimately her son Nick became her donor. I watched by her side as she went from vital actress and mother to cancer patient. I saw far more clearly than ever before how terrifying it is to be a patient, how families hang on the doctor's every word. Things I had taken for granted, like waiting for results, become very different if you're a patient waiting for tests or for a doctor's call or visit. Victoria checked her identity at the door. She had her head shaved when she grew tired of her hair falling out all the time. She was hooked to IV pumps, which seemed to beep continually. An IV pole was her constant companion. To her doctors, she was a patient. Only months before, she had been a vital actress, mother, and wife. Few knew the little girl I had grown up with. But this is the story of each and every patient. I began to appreciate the power of empathy and compassion. Compassion means to suffer with. Patients want to know that their doctors care about them. Care not rooted in compassion doesn't feel very good at all. Doctors miss opportunities. We avoid emotional exposure and tend to substitute technology and precision or procedures for meaningful connections. I wince when I look back on those missed opportunities in my own practice. Connecting with my emotions and with my patients became vital to me. I realized the emotional armor I had created didn't work. It didn't protect me from these emotions, only just pushed them away and buried them. And it was starting to interfere with the quality of my life. Forgoing a defended posture led to a personal transformation. It was as if I went from seeing in black and white to suddenly seeing in color. We become able to connect when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Doctors avoid this, often out of fear. They say they don't have time, but it takes only 17 seconds to forge an empathetic bond with a patient. All it really takes is a willingness to go there. Being vulnerable means admitting that I'm unable to solve problems or cure patients I desperately want to help, and to admit failure. One moment brought home this change for me. I was standing at the bedside of a young man with his mother. He had been paralyzed in a devastating car accident and was about to die. There was nothing we could do to save him. Words completely failed me. Instead of retreating to my normal stance of fact-based detachment, I reached out to her and I hugged her. We held on to each other and both of us cried. I would never have done this before Victoria's illness, but afterwards I was far more aware of the depth of this woman's suffering. There was nothing I could do to help her son. I tried to help her, and she in turn helped me by helping restore my humanity. In her TED Talk, Brené Brown invites us to welcome our vulnerability and shows us that it's a sign of strength and power, not one of weakness. But surprisingly, she says that surgeons in their jobs can't afford to be vulnerable, and I disagree. Surgeons must allow ourselves to be vulnerable. We must connect with our patients. Compassion must come with us to the operating room. Without it, we expose our patients to too much risk, such as over-operating or cutting corners. Especially under anesthesia, our patients' interests need to be foremost in our minds. Through Victoria's experience, I began to appreciate that we will all become patients. And procedures, while sometimes important, are not always paramount. Megan White was an example of this. Like Victoria, she was a young woman with a terminal illness. She had been sent to me to have a reservoir placed in her brain to be able to deliver medications, chemotherapy to help control, but not to cure, her metastatic breast cancer. I asked Megan what was important to her, and she said finishing out the school year with her 4th grade was something she did not want to miss. That meant delaying her surgery for 2 weeks, something that didn't matter in the end, but being able to say goodbye to her students was important to her. The old me would have scheduled her surgery and moved on. The new me sat and held her hand. I listened to what she wanted me. Before me, she was putting on a brave front, but I could tell she was terrified. And I thought of Victoria, who had faced similar daunting challenges with courage. And I cried. I would never have done this in the past, but I had allowed Victoria's spirit to change me. 18 months after my sister Victoria died, her husband Pat had a brain hemorrhage from a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. His son Nick, the one who had donated his bone marrow for his mother, did CPR on his father and called EMS. And Pat went to the neurosurgical ICU at UCLA, where he spent the next 2 weeks. I was his healthcare power of attorney, which means I had to make medical decisions on his behalf, including agreeing to brain surgery and ultimately deciding to withdraw treatment. I was also a neurosurgeon, suddenly on the receiving end of patient care. Again, I saw how disruptive and terrifying it is to be a patient, and how families cling to every word of the doctor and the medical team. I saw how Pat ceased to be the vital man he was prior to admission, and instead he became a head on a bed. All the decisions we made only made sense in the context of who he was, but the medical team didn't know him or what he wanted. And I knew as a neurosurgeon that procedures, while they mattered, only mattered so much. The compassion of the medical team was vitally important to us. Its absence felt like a searing wound. I had to push to level the power dynamic between the medical team and his family. At times it felt as if we were on a conveyor belt of care, where decisions were being made based on protocols rather than as expressions of his hopes and dreams. In the end, we decided to honor his wishes, to withdraw treatment and let him die. Even with all my knowledge and training, this was very hard. Victoria's sons had been shielded from their mother's death. They had never realized how sick she was, and when she died, they were shocked and devastated. With Pat, we did things differently. We invited them into discussions and included them in decisions on his care. Late one night, we sat at their kitchen table, and we told them we thought it was time to stop. I was scared of having that discussion with them, but they thanked us for our honesty and for including them in their father's care. And I was surprised by their gratitude. They were able to help plan his funeral, and this allowed them to begin to heal. Palliative care came too little and too late in both Victoria and Pat's cases. Palliative care is goal-centered care focused on comfort. It's multidisciplinary and includes nurses and doctors and needs to become much more readily available. Currently, 55% of doctors describe themselves as burned out. Many quit or retire early. I don't think it's the exposure to sadness and grief that causes them to burn out. If it were, palliative care doctors would all be burned out. Instead, they're some of the happiest doctors around. No, I think it's the barriers we place to these emotions and the armor we put in place of real close experience that contributes to burnout. Connecting with our emotions and opening our hearts is actually a source of power and great satisfaction. Still, I agree with Dr. Brown. Surgeons can't afford to be vulnerable all the time. How do I take a patient and have an intense conversation with them 1 minute, and the next minute take them to and perform brain surgery without falling to pieces? How do I protect myself? The answer is through emotional agility. This allows us to experience a range of conflicting emotions without becoming bogged down or stuck. Through emotional agility, people with emotional agility are dynamic and powerful. They gain power from facing rather than avoiding difficult emotions, and they recognize that life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility. With emotional agility, we're able to connect deeply with our patients and with ourselves, increasing engagement and satisfaction and staving off burnout. With emotional agility, I've been able to have a meaningful conversation with a patient 1 minute and then take that patient to surgery the next. It's no longer a choice between emotional connection and dispassionate technical precision. You can have both. It's no longer either or, but and. An important component of emotional agility is self-compassion. This is the ability to forgive ourselves for our inevitable failings and shortcomings. Empathy and agility can both be taught. They must become central in medical education. They're difficult to learn even with direct training and almost impossible to master without it. I only began to learn them through the personal crisis that rocked my world. I have spoken about my evolution as a neurosurgeon. But what's the take-home message for us as patients? Why does my journey even matter? It turns out what I'm talking about matters to each of us. We all deserve physicians with whom we can forge a meaningful connection. Bedside manner is important. It's not just window dressing. If you feel dismissed by your doctor, find a new one. If your doctor isn't interested in who you are or what's important to you, choose someone else. Compassion needs to be at the center of the patient-doctor relationship. Without it, we may agree to procedures we perhaps shouldn't have or let people make decisions on our behalf that may not be in our best interests. Without asserting our interests, hospitals can be cold, mechanical, inhumane places where our loved ones may languish half dead against our better instincts. Victoria was unwilling to accept the possibility that she might die, and she wouldn't consider the survival statistics of her illness. This included a 6% 5-year survival rate for her type of leukemia, essentially a death sentence at the time of diagnosis. She believed that breathing life into this would make it happen. Denial was her emotional armor. So when her transplant failed and her leukemia came back, her doctor substituted milder chemotherapy, which didn't work. Like a magic show that's distracted everyone from the inevitability of her death. Her doctors never spoke with her about dying, and as a result, she never said goodbye to her husband, Pat, or to their 2 sons, Nick and Will. And this was tragic and a missed opportunity for all of them. Patients have responsibilities to become educated about their conditions so that they can make better choices. Education is important, but so too is preparation. We're all going to die. We'll all become patients. This isn't a mystery. The time to talk about this is before we get sick, not after. Everyone needs advanced directives and to have thought these things through. You can't believe how often I take care of patients who've never spoken about this. Avoidance doesn't work here either. It turns out a good death requires planning and forethought. It turns out we all use emotional armor to protect ourselves from intense emotional experiences, and it rarely does us any good. I have become happier and healthier, striving towards emotional agility. Giving up my pursuit of perfection and precision in favor of connection and compassion has made me feel happier and healthier. And I feel better without my ill-fitting emotional armor weighing me down. We will all be happier with doctors who aren't detached and defended. And if we can forego our own emotional armor, we'll be happier and healthier too. So don't let health systems define us by our illnesses. Stand up for what's important to you and your family member. This is all the more important if, like Pat, your loved one is in a coma and can't speak up for himself. Compassion needs to be the core value of our healthcare experience. This is all the more important with the isolation and anxiety we're all feeling during the COVID pandemic. We are all vulnerable. We can no longer afford to take for granted our shared humanity and the power of connection. Now more than ever, compassion is the key foundation for healing. Take a moment to imagine how sweet life would be for all of us if we followed this path.